Today I want to share with you how I've set up my Nikon Z6II for wildlife photography using the Nikon 200-500. So let's jump into it. Now the way I've set up my Nikon Z6II is really specific to the Nikon 200-500. If you're using another lens, then some of these settings might be different. Understand that everybody sets up their cameras the way that they like it and the way that they felt that they've had the best results. So the settings that I use are the settings that I found that I get the best results when I'm out taking wildlife photos, because this is what I do now around 80% of the time. I don't shoot too much in landscape. I hardly shoot astro these days, so the bulk of my time is spent photographing wildlife, and I enjoy doing this. Now, how have I set up my Nikon Z6II, and how have I set up the Nikon 200-500? Because both of them are a matched pair. And if you're using the 200-500 for wildlife photography with the Nikon Z6II, you're going to get some fantastic results if you just pay attention to some of the settings that I show you here. Now on the top left, we have the mode dial, where we can set the mode that we want to be in. We want to be in manual, aperture priority, shutter priority. The Z6II also has U1, U2, U3. So some people just like setting up in manual, so we can choose our shutter speed and also our aperture. But there's no need to be in manual mode. We can choose one of the U program modes. We have U1, U2, U3. I have set up U2 has my wildlife photography setting because I shoot video and photos. So in U2 mode, I set my minimum shutter speed and my aperture that I want to shoot. The 200-500, the minimum is f5.6, and that's what I shoot on 90% of the time. Sometimes I might go to f8, but I have found that f5.6, I get sharp photos all the time. And remember, with wildlife, we're not looking at the outer edges. It doesn't matter if the outer edges are a bit soft. We're really concentrating on the center third of the image because that is where our subject's going to be. We're not going to look at something in the corners. We're always zoomed in. We want to get the bird or the animal as close as possible and in the center, because that's where we like the photograph. So I find that at f5.6, I get great images. In U2 mode, I set my shutter speed and my aperture. So let's start with basic settings: the shutter speed, the aperture, my white balance, the ISO. I've always stated that I like shooting the aperture wide open at f5.6. My shutter speed is set at 1600. On the day, if I feel that I have to reduce the shutter speed, I might reduce it, but I rarely do this unless I've got very low light. Why? Because I never know if the bird's going to take flight, and I like sharp images if the bird is taking flight. If I'm photographing subjects like kingfishers, small birds, then I will increase my shutter speed to around 2.5 thousandths of a second, sometimes even 3,200th of a second, depending on light. My ISO is set to auto. I always leave it set to auto so that the camera can balance out the whole metering process. Because remember, I've set manually my shutter speed, manually my aperture. I need one of the three, shutter speed, aperture, or ISO, to balance out my exposure, and the ISO is the one that balances out my exposure. The white balance on my Nikon Z6II is set to natural light auto. Natural light auto gives me what I see out in the field, and I hardly ever have to adjust my white balance when I edit my photos because the camera gets it right in the field. Now metering on the Z6II, we have spot, we have center weighted, and we have matrix. Matrix is great for landscape, but it's not great for wildlife. Why? Because we're focusing on a single subject and we want that subject to be correctly exposed. We're not looking at the whole frame. So the metering is set to center weighted. If I'm photographing a bird like an egret, which is white, I will switch to spot because that will give me the best indication that I'm not blowing out the highlights. white birds are very hard to photograph because they just reflect light. So if I'm photographing egrets or white birds like cockatoos, corellas, I will go to spot metering and my exposure will be correct. The Z6II has quite a few focusing modes, and only 3 of them I use consistently. The 3 that I use consistently are single point, dynamic area AF, or wide area AF small. If it's a bird in flight, I will use wide area AF small because that gives me the best chance of tracking birds. Dynamic area AF is my go-to mode 90% of the time. I will use single point AF where it is in a challenging situation. I've found that where dynamic area AF lets me down is if I'm low to the ground and I'm photographing a bird on the water, like ducks and grebes, because I found sometimes dynamic area AF will lock on just in front of my subject. So not to have any problems with AF, if I'm photographing subjects like that, then I will use single point because I've found that the camera struggles less to find my subject. It just gets confused. The Z6II has a great feature is that I have the eye menu. Being a mirrorless, I can look at everything through the viewfinder. So if I want to change my metering, if I want to change my focusing modes, I don't have to take my eye off the viewfinder like I had to do with the D500. I can just press the eye menu and there everything is. Now I'll show you how I've set up the eye menu for wildlife photography. So we go into the camera here. I have metering, and in metering you can see it's set to center weighted. On the left we have matrix metering, which I say I don't use, and on the right we have spot metering. I always leave it on center weighted. Then we have the auto-focusing modes, and like I stated, I use single point, I use dynamic area AF, or wide area AF small. After that, we have the release mode. Now this is something that I haven't talked about, is the frame rate. What frame rate do I use? Do I use continuous flow? Do I use continuous high? Or do I use continuous high extended? Because they're the 3 modes for wildlife. We don't use single frame, which means that every time you press the shutter button here, it only takes 1 photo. The Z6II is quite slow. Even in continuous high will only allow you 5.5 frames per second. I've found on average it stays around 4.8 to 5 frames per second. So I use continuous high extended, which gives you the ability to shoot up to 14 frames per second. But I've found the way that I've set up my camera, I'm getting around 8 to 9 frames per second, and I'm very happy with that. Then I can choose FX or DX. The camera is set to FX, which means I'm using the total sensor size 24 megapixel. But if the bird is far from me, I will go into DX mode. And one of the benefits of going into DX mode when the bird is far from me is you're helping the autofocusing mode because you're getting closer to the bird. Remember, when you're going from FX to DX, you're cropping in. So you're helping the camera, you're helping the metering, you're helping the focusing modes, you're helping the camera get a better photo for you. You let the camera do the work. The next one here is white balance. And like I said, I prefer natural light auto. It gets me the best setting. Then we just go all the way back again to the left. I have silent photography. I've talked about how I love using silent photography. Why? I don't get blackouts. If you're using continuous low or continuous high, then you're getting that blackout. And it's very hard if you're tracking a bird in flight. Even if the bird is not moving much, it's very hard to keep focusing on the bird. So I like using silent photography. Now, one caveat that I have to mention is that if you are in silent photography, you need to have VR on. I will put up here a sample of some photos taken with VR on and with VR off in silent photography. And you will see that if VR is switched off in silent photography, you will get all sorts of distortion in your image. This is on a tripod. This should not happen, but it does. So remember, if you're using silent photography with the Nikon 200-500, remember everything here is related to me using the 200-500. So if you're using this lens with your Z6II with continuous high extended and silent photography, make sure that VR is switched off or you will see this problem. The last is my focus mode, and that is we could choose AFS, which is single, AFC, which is autofocus continuous. When we're shooting wildlife, we're always shooting in autofocus continuous, or manual focus. Once you've got all the settings that you like, you've set your shutter speed, you've set your aperture, silent photography, your white balance and all that, all you do, you go into the menu and you go down to the spanner and you go across to save user settings. And you can see here it says save to U1, save to U2, or save to U3. I want U2. I go across and says save settings, and I just hit OK. My settings are saved. Now when I shut off my camera, the next time I turn it on, all my settings will be saved. If you're shooting landscape as well, you can set U1 to landscape. If you're shooting landscape and astro, then you can set U1 to landscape, set up all your settings there, and then U3, if you're shooting astros, all your settings there. So when you get out in the field, your settings are saved, and there's no need to muck around in your camera. Now, like a lot of wildlife photographers, I like using back button focus because it means that my shutter button here is only used to take the photo. If you're not using back button focus, it means every time you press the shutter button here, the camera will focus. So if you're tracking a bird, every time you press the shutter button, if you are not using back button focus, then the camera has to refocus and you're going to miss shots. A lot of people do not realize that the Nikon 200-500 f5.6 is tripod aware. 90% of my wildlife photography now is done on a tripod. So if you're hand holding your camera while you're out taking photos, some of these settings might be different to you, but you could always try them. I have VR turned on all the time, and it is set in sports mode. I know people state that once you're over really 1,200th of a second, you shouldn't be using VR. Well, I've found that I need VR. I suffer from the shakes, and even with the camera on a tripod, VR helps me get better shots. It keeps the camera stable. It keeps my focus point on the bird. It's not moving around at all. And I've tried VR on, VR off. There is no difference in quality to the image, so I don't lose any image quality. Also, I've tried between normal and sports mode, and I have found that in normal mode on VR that it's still going to jump around a little bit, but in sports mode it stays rock steady. Yes, because of VR, I find that the focus just slows down just a midget, but I just look at overall picture, what is going to get me the best photos consistently. So the small things I don't worry about. I'm looking at the overall big picture. That is how I set up the lens. Now that is how I've set up my Nikon Z6II with the 200-500 for photographing wildlife. If you've got any comment or feedback, leave it in the comments box below and I'll answer your question. If you like the video, give it a big thumbs up. Stay safe, enjoy your wildlife photography, and I'll see you next time.